In the year 1631, at around 2 in the morning, the quiet Irish village of Baltimore woke to the sound of screams. Pirates from North Africa had arrived under the cover of darkness. They broke down doors, dragged men, women, and children from their beds, and chained them together in the streets while their homes burned behind them. Before sunrise, the captives were forced onto ships sailing toward North Africa. Among them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. She had never left her village and never imagined that people from a distant world would appear in the middle of the night and steal her life away. Weeks later, Joan stood in a slave market in Algiers, surrounded by strangers who examined her as if she were livestock. Buyers walked around her, checking her arms, her teeth, and every detail of her body to decide what price she was worth. Eventually, she was sold to a merchant for the value of a few farm animals. Joan was not alone. Between 1530 and 1780, more than 1 million Europeans were captured and sold into slavery across North Africa and the Ottoman world. People from Spain, Italy, France, Ireland, and even Iceland were taken from their homes and forced into a system that treated human beings like merchandise. These attacks were carried out by the Barbary pirates, who operated from powerful ports such as Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Sale. They were not random criminals, but organized raiders backed by political authorities who profited from the trade. Their ships sailed along European coasts and struck villages at night or at dawn when people were defenseless. They took gold, silver, and supplies, but their most valuable prize was always people. A human being could be sold again and again, which made slavery an incredibly profitable business. For centuries, coastal communities across Europe lived in constant fear. Families went to sleep each night, wondering if they would wake to the sound of strangers breaking through their doors. Entire villages were eventually abandoned as people moved inland away from the sea. Watchtowers were built along the coastline, and church bells were used to warn communities of approaching ships. But even with these defenses, the raids continued because the pirates studied the weaknesses of every settlement and struck when people least expected it. One of the many victims was a Dutch woman named Maria Terellen. In 1731, while traveling on a merchant ship near Spain, her vessel was attacked by pirates at dawn. Older men were killed and thrown into the sea while the younger passengers were chained together. Maria and dozens of other women were forced into the dark cargo hold of the ship, where there was almost no space to move. For more than 2 weeks, they sat in darkness, breathing foul air, surrounded by sickness, fear, and despair. Several women died during the journey, and their bodies were simply thrown into the ocean. When the ship finally reached North Africa, the captives were washed and prepared for sale in the slave market. The process was brutally organized. Strong men were sent to hard labor or forced to row ships, where many died within a few years. Children were trained as servants and often grew up forgetting their original homes and languages. Women over a certain age were sent to domestic work, but young women between 15 and 30 were the most valuable of all, because they were sold into wealthy households or harems. Before being sold, the women were placed on public platforms where buyers inspected them closely. Their health and strength were examined while strangers touched them freely to judge their value. Any attempt to resist was punished with immediate violence. This humiliating process happened openly in crowded markets and was considered completely normal within that system. Joan Broadbrook experienced this reality when she was sold and transported to Istanbul. When she arrived, everything connected to her past was taken away. Her European clothing was burned, and she was dressed in new garments and forced to learn a new language. Life inside a household or a harem was not the luxurious fantasy often imagined in stories. For many women, it was a life of isolation, control, and constant fear, where they had no rights and no power over their own lives. Some women spent years performing exhausting domestic work from early morning until late at night. Others were kept as concubines and used whenever their owner wished. Many were sold repeatedly throughout their lives, moving from one household to another. Every sale meant a new master, new rules, and a new struggle to survive. The most mysterious and feared destination was the imperial harem of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. It was a massive complex inside the palace where hundreds of women lived, Many were brought there as young girls and trained for years in language, etiquette, music, and court traditions. Yet the truth behind the legend was far less glamorous than people believed. Out of hundreds of women, only a small number ever met the Sultan, while the rest spent their entire lives waiting in isolation. One European slave, known in records as Francesca, entered the palace at the age of 15 and remained there. For more than 50 years, she never met the Sultan and never left the palace walls. When she died, she was buried without a name and was recorded only as a number in administrative documents. Her story was just one of countless lives that disappeared inside that system. A small number of captives were eventually freed through ransom payments raised by their families or religious groups. Maria Torellin was one of the few who managed to return home after 8 years in captivity, but freedom did not restore her life. Her fiancé had married someone else, her mother had died from grief, and her community treated her with suspicion and shame. She spent the rest of her life alone, working quietly and writing about the pain of returning to a world that no longer felt like home. For more than 2 centuries, the system continued, largely unchecked. European nations were divided by religious wars and political rivalries, and often failed to unite against the threat. Trade relationships and financial interests also prevented stronger action. Only in the 19th century did major military campaigns finally put an end to the system, when North African pirate strongholds were attacked and dismantled. By that time, more than 1 million people had been captured, and most of them never returned to their homes. Joan Broadbrook eventually gained her freedom, but when she tried to return to Ireland, she discovered that the life she remembered was gone. For years, her name had been read in prayers in her village church, but eventually even those prayers stopped, and her story faded from memory. This history is not just about one woman or one village. It is about the countless men, women, and children whose lives were taken by a system that turned human suffering into profit. Their stories remind us that behind every number in history, there were real people with families, dreams, and lives that were suddenly and violently taken away.